It began with a silence that felt too deliberate. For weeks, intelligence chatter hinted at something brewing beneath the surface, an uneasy calm between two historic adversaries. But when the first Iranian rocket, sourced from Russian arsenals, tore through the night sky and struck deep into Israeli territory, the world was jolted into a new reality. This wasn't just another skirmish. It was a calculated strike, one that exposed a vulnerability Israel had long kept hidden. Its nuclear supply was not infinite. The rockets weren't ordinary. These were precision-guided, long-range ballistic missiles, enhanced with Russian engineering and satellite targeting. Iran's acquisition of such weaponry had been dismissed by many as posturing. But now the results were undeniable. The impact zones weren't random, they were strategic. Military installations, suspected nuclear storage sites, and command centers were hit with chilling accuracy. And in the aftermath, a revelation emerged. Israel's nuclear deterrent, the backbone of its regional dominance, had been critically depleted. For decades, Israel's nuclear ambiguity had served as a shield. It never confirmed, never denied, but always implied. That implication alone was enough to keep adversaries at bay. Until now, the Iranian strike didn't just damage infrastructure. It shattered perception. Suddenly, the myth of invincibility was gone. And with it, the balance of power in the Middle East began to shift. This wasn't just a military event. It was a geopolitical earthquake. The question wasn't whether Israel would retaliate. It was whether it could. And as global powers scrambled to interpret the fallout, one truth became clear. The era of assumed supremacy was over. The rules had changed, and the players were no longer bluffing. The international response was swift but fractured. Western allies, long accustomed to Israel's strategic dominance, were caught off guard. Washington issued a statement of unwavering support, but behind closed doors, Pentagon analysts were scrambling to reassess deterrence models. France and Germany called for de-escalation, while Russia, predictably, denied involvement in supplying Iran with the advanced missile systems. Yet satellite imagery and intercepted communications told a different story. The rockets bore unmistakable Russian signatures, guidance systems, fuel composites, and launch protocols that matched archived data from Moscow's own arsenal. Iran, emboldened by the success of its strike, didn't gloat, calculated. Tehran's foreign ministry framed the attack as defensive retaliation, citing years of covert Israeli operations and sabotage. But the subtext was clear. This was a message, a demonstration of reach, precision, and resolve. And it landed not just in Tel Aviv, but in every capital watching from afar. Inside Israel, the mood shifted from shock to urgency. Military command convened emergency sessions. Civil defense protocols were activated. But the most pressing concern wasn't the physical damage, it was psychological. The Israeli public, long reassured by the silent strength of its nuclear deterrent, now faced a sobering truth. The arsenal wasn't untouchable. And worse, it wasn't replenishable overnight. Contrast that with Iran's growing alliance with Russia, a partnership once seen as opportunistic, now appearing strategic. Joint exercises, arms deals, and intelligence sharing had matured into something more formidable. The Middle East wasn't just shifting, it was being reshaped. And Israel, for the first time in decades, found itself reacting rather than dictating. The world watched, not for the next move, but for the next miscalculation. Because in a region where perception is power, losing control of the narrative can be as dangerous as losing control of the arsenal. In the corridors of global diplomacy, whispers turned into urgent conversations. The United Nations convened an emergency session, not out of protocol, but out of genuine alarm. The idea that Israel long considered the region's nuclear insurance policy had suffered a depletion of its strategic stockpile sent shockwaves through defense ministries worldwide. The equilibrium that had kept hostile actors in check was now teetering. And in that vacuum, new ambitions began to stir. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, nations with dormant nuclear aspirations, started revisiting old blueprints. If Israel's deterrent could be compromised, then the race for self-reliance was no longer theoretical. It was survival. Meanwhile, Iran's messaging remained calculated. No further strikes.
No escalation.
Just silence and the lingering echo of a successful operation. That restraint, paradoxically, amplified its power. It wasn't just about what Iran did. It was about what it could do next. Inside Israel, contingency plans were activated. Submarine fleets repositioned. Air defenses recalibrated. But the most critical conversations weren't happening in war rooms. They were happening in scientific labs and diplomatic backchannels. Rebuilding a nuclear supply isn't like restocking ammunition. It requires time, secrecy, and international maneuvering. And time suddenly was a luxury Israel didn't have. Contrast that with Russia's quiet satisfaction. Officially uninvolved, unofficially instrumental. By supplying Iran, Moscow hadn't just armed an ally. It had destabilized a rival's strategic edge without firing a single shot. The geopolitical chessboard had shifted, and Russia had moved a piece that forced the West to rethink its entire playbook. The world wasn't watching for explosions anymore. It was watching for silence, for the kind that precedes a storm. And in that silence, one truth loomed large. Deterrence is only as strong as its last demonstration. Israel's was fading. Iran's had just begun. In Tel Aviv, the prime minister addressed the nation with a tone that was both resolute and restrained. "We will restore what was lost," he declared, but the subtext was unmistakable. Israel was navigating unfamiliar terrain. The confidence that once underpinned its foreign policy had been shaken. Not destroyed, but undeniably dented. And in the shadows of that speech, a new kind of war began to unfold. One not of missiles, but of influence. Cyber units were mobilized. Intelligence agencies shifted focus from physical retaliation to digital disruption. Iran's infrastructure, power grids, communication networks, and financial systems became targets of silent warfare. The goal wasn't to provoke. It was to destabilize, to remind Tehran that Israel's reach extended beyond warheads. But even these efforts carried risk. The line between deterrence and escalation had never been thinner. Meanwhile, Iran's alliance with Russia deepened. Joint press conferences, shared satellite data, and coordinated naval patrols in the Persian Gulf signaled a new axis of power. It wasn't just about weapons anymore, it was about legitimacy. Russia's backing gave Iran a diplomatic shield, one that complicated any Western response. And Israel, once the region's unchallenged force, now had to navigate a chessboard where every move was scrutinized, every counterstrike weighed against global consequence. Contrast that with the silence from China, a major player, yet conspicuously absent from the narrative. Analysts speculated. Was Beijing waiting to broker peace, or simply watching the West unravel? Either way, the vacuum of leadership was palpable. And in that void, smaller nations began to recalibrate their loyalties. The Middle East was no longer a battlefield, it was a proving ground. And as alliances shifted and arsenals thinned, one question lingered. Could Israel reinvent its deterrence before the next strike, or had the balance already tipped? The final reckoning wasn't marked by sirens or speeches. It came in the form of quiet recalibration. Israel, battered but unbroken, began the arduous process of redefining its strategic doctrine. The old playbook, built on ambiguity, deterrence, and overwhelming response, no longer applied. In its place, a new paradigm emerged. Resilience through transparency, alliances through necessity, and deterrence through innovation. Scientific teams accelerated research into next-generation defense systems, laser interceptors, AI-driven threat detection, and quantum encryption. The goal wasn't just to rebuild what was lost, but to leap ahead, to create a deterrent not rooted in fear, but in technological superiority. And while the nuclear supply had been compromised, Israel's capacity for reinvention remained intact. Iran, meanwhile, faced its own reckoning. The strike had elevated its status, but also its exposure.
Sanctions tightened. Surveillance intensified.
And within its borders, whispers of caution began to surface. Had the message been too loud? Had the victory invited too much attention? The line between triumph and vulnerability blurred. Russia, having played its hand, retreated into strategic silence. Its objective had been met, destabilize without direct engagement. But the long-term consequences were unpredictable. The West, now fully awake to the shifting dynamics, began forging new coalitions, not just to support Israel, but to prevent the next rupture. And so the region held its breath, not in fear, but in anticipation. The balance of power had shifted, but not settled. The game had changed, but the players remained. And in that fragile equilibrium, one truth echoed louder than any explosion. Deterrence is not a weapon. It's a story, one that must be believed to be effective. Israel's story was being rewritten, and the world was watching every word.